the battle that turned the tide. Guadalcanal. In the dark heart of World War II's Pacific theatre, one island became the stage for a clash that would change everything. The Guadalcanal campaign, codenamed Operation Watchtower, was the Allies' first major land offensive against the Empire of Japan, fought from August 7, 1942, to February 9, 1943, when U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Florida Island. They weren't just fighting for territory. They were fighting to stop Japan's advance across the Pacific. What began as a quick strike turned into a brutal 6-month struggle for survival in the dense, unforgiving jungle. The Allies seized an unfinished Japanese airstrip and transformed it into Henderson Field, a key lifeline for control of the skies. From that moment, the island became a battlefield of constant chaos. Bombings, naval clashes, and savage night assaults. Japan struck back again and again, from Savo Island to Cape Esperance, from the Eastern Solomons to Santa Cruz. But the U.S. Navy and Marines held their ground. The decisive naval battle of Guadalcanal in November sealed Japan's fate. By February 1943, the last Japanese troops were gone. This wasn't just a victory. It was the moment the Allies seized the initiative, turning defense into offense. The road to victory in the Pacific began here, on a humid island where courage met chaos, Guadalcanal. Strategic considerations. Between May and August 1942, Japan held firm control over the western Pacific. Guadalcanal lay in the lower right of this vast domain, strategically positioned yet soon to become the center of one of World War II's fiercest battles. On the 7th of December 1941, Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, killing nearly 500 people and crippling much of America's battleship strength. The assault prompted formal declarations of war between Japan and the United States the next day. Japan's early war objectives were clear: neutralize U.S. naval power, seize territories rich in vital resources, and establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific and Asia to secure its growing empire. In quick succession, Japanese forces captured the Philippines, Thailand, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island, the Gilbert Islands, New Britain, and Guam. The United States was soon joined by Allied powers, including the British Empire and the Dutch government, in exile, both of which had also come under Japanese attack. Seeking to extend its defensive ring and threaten Australia, Hawaii, and even the U.S. West Coast, Japan launched two major offensives in the South and Central Pacific. The first ended in the Battle of the Coral Sea, which, though tactically indecisive, proved a strategic victory for the Allies. It marked Japan's first major setback and severely weakened its carrier power. Undeterred, Japan pressed on with an attempted overland assault on Port Moresby via the Kokoda Track, but this too faltered. The second grand offensive was crushed at the Battle of Midway, a decisive engagement that cost Japan irreplaceable carriers, aircraft, and elite pilots. While the Americans rapidly rebuilt their naval air forces, Japan could not. These hard-won victories allowed the Allies to shift from defense to offense and begin seizing the strategic initiative across the Pacific. The Allies selected the Solomon Islands, a British protectorate, as the target for their first major offensive. The focus was the southern islands of Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Florida Island, grouped under Task 1 as codename Pestilence. Initial objectives included the Santa Cruz Islands Huddle, Tulagi Watchtower, and nearby positions. Guadalcanal's codename Cactus was not part of the early plans, but gained importance when reconnaissance revealed the Japanese constructing an airfield there. Tulagi's deep harbor made it ideal for seaplane operations, and Florida Island needed to be taken to secure it. Guadalcanal, much larger and lying just across what would soon be called Iron Bottom Sound, became the central focus of the coming campaign. By May 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy IJN had already occupied Tulagi and established a seaplane base. Alarm grew among the Allies when, in July, the IJN began building a major airfield at Lunga Point on Guadalcanal. From that base, Japanese bombers could threaten vital sea routes between America's west coast and Australia's east coast. By August, the Japanese had stationed about 900 naval troops on Tulagi and nearby islands, and 800 personnel on Guadalcanal, including 200 Korean laborers and Japanese engineers. These outposts were intended to shield the main base at Rabaul, cut off Allied supply lines, and serve as launch points for Operation FS, an offensive against Fiji, New Caledonia, and Samoa. Japan planned to deploy 45 fighters and 60 bombers to Guadalcanal, providing air cover for naval operations deeper into the South Pacific. The plan for the Allied counteroffensive originated with Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. fleet. He proposed seizing the Southern Solomons to deny Japan use of the islands as bases that could threaten supply routes between the U.S. and Australia, and to use them as springboards for future operations. With President Franklin D. Roosevelt's quiet approval, King pushed forward with plans for the invasion of Guadalcanal. However, because the administration prioritized defeating Germany before Japan, resources were stretched thin, forcing Pacific commanders to compete with the European theater for men and material. Early disagreements also arose over command authority. Tulagi fell under General Douglas MacArthur's jurisdiction, while the Santa Cruz Islands were part of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's Pacific Ocean area, which would provide most of the Allied striking power. These issues were resolved when General George C. Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, endorsed the operation. To maintain unity of command, responsibility was assigned to the U.S. Navy, and the boundary between MacArthur's and Nimitz's areas was moved westward by about 360 miles, 580 kph, effective of August 1942. Admiral William D. Leary, Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief, established two overarching goals for 1942-1943. First, to seize Guadalcanal in conjunction with MacArthur's offensive in New Guinea, and second, to capture the Admiralty Islands and the Bismarck Archipelago, including the key Japanese base at Rabaul. These steps would pave the way for the ultimate objective, the liberation of the Philippines, from which U.S. forces had been expelled earlier that year. To carry out the campaign, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff created the South Pacific Theater, placing Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley in command on the 19th of June 1942. Admiral Nimitz, based at Pearl Harbor, was designated the overall Allied Commander-in-Chief for all Pacific operations. Preparation for the Pacific Offensive in May 1942. As preparations for a major Pacific offensive gathered momentum, U.S. Marine Major General Alexander Vandergrift was ordered to deploy his 1st Marine Division from the United States to New Zealand. Meanwhile, other Allied land, naval, and air units were dispatched to establish or reinforce bases across Fiji, Samoa, the New Hebrides, and New Caledonia. The island of Espiritu Santo, located in the New Hebrides, was selected as the headquarters and principal staging area for the forthcoming assault, codenamed Operation Watchtower, which was scheduled to commence on the 7th of August. Initially, the operation envisioned only the seizure of Tulagi and the Santa Cruz Islands, excluding any landings on Guadalcanal. However, after Allied reconnaissance revealed Japanese efforts to construct an airfield on Guadalcanal, the plan was revised to include its capture, while the projected assault on the Santa Cruz Islands was ultimately abandoned. Although Japanese signals intelligence detected the large-scale movement of Allied forces throughout the South Pacific, Japanese commanders incorrectly concluded that the Allies were reinforcing either Australia or Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea. The Watchtower Task Force, consisting of 75 warships and transport vessels from both the United States and Australia, assembled near Fiji on the 26th of July, where it conducted a single rehearsal landing before setting sail for Guadalcanal on the 31st of July. The expeditionary force was commanded by Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher, leader of Task Force 16, whose flagship was the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga. The amphibious forces were under the direction of Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, while Major General Vandergrift commanded the 16 Zarozan Allied troops, primarily U.S. Marines designated for the amphibious landings. The Marines deployed to Guadalcanal were newly trained and relatively inexperienced, equipped mainly with bolt-action M1903 Springfield rifles and supplied with only a 10-day reserve of ammunition. Because rapid deployment was critical, Allied planners reduced the standard 90-day supply to just 60 days. Aware of their limited resources and the enormous risks ahead, the men of the 1st Marine Division wryly dubbed their mission Operation Shoestring. The Allied landing and the midnight raid on Guadalcanal. Under the cover of bad weather, the Allied expeditionary force approached Guadalcanal undetected on the night of 6th of August and the morning of 7th of August, achieving complete surprise against the Japanese defenders. This daring approach later became known as the Midnight Raid on Guadalcanal. A Japanese patrol aircraft operating from Tulagi had searched the surrounding seas for enemy movements, but failed to locate the Allied fleet due to heavy storms and dense cloud cover. The Allied landing force was divided into two main groups, one assigned to assault Guadalcanal, and the other directed toward Tulagi, Florida Island, and nearby smaller islands. Prior to the landings, Allied warships unleashed intense naval bombardments on the designated beaches, while U.S. carrier-based aircraft struck Japanese installations across the target area, destroying 15 seaplanes stationed at their base near Tulagi. The assaults on Tulagi and the nearby islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo were carried out by 3,000 U.S. Marines under the command of Brigadier General William Rupertus. The 1886 personnel of the Imperial Japanese Navy, defending the naval and seaplane facilities across the three islands, resisted fiercely, fighting to the last with remarkable determination. After intense close-quarters combat, the Marines succeeded in securing Tulagi by 8th of August, and Gavutu and Tanambogo by the following day, 9th of August. The Japanese garrisons were annihilated almost to the last man, while the Marines sustained 248 casualties during the hard-fought engagements. The landings on Guadalcanal, in contrast to the fierce resistance encountered on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, the Guadalcanal landings met with minimal opposition. At 09:10 on the 7th of August, Major General Alexander Vandergrift led 11,000 U.S. Marines ashore between Point and Lunga Point. Advancing inland toward Lunga Point, the Marines met only scattered Japanese resistance and successfully secured the airfield by 1600 on 8th of August. The Japanese naval construction units and combat personnel, commanded by Captain Kane Monzon, had panicked under the intensity of the Allied naval bombardment and aerial attacks. Abandoning their positions in haste, they retreated approximately 3 miles 5 km westward to the Matanikau River and Point Cruz area, leaving behind substantial stores of food supplies, operational construction machinery vehicles, and 13 dead around the airfield and its vicinity. During the landings on 7 and 8 August, Rabaul-based Japanese naval aircraft under the command of Yamada Sadayoshi launched repeated assaults against the Allied amphibious forces. These attacks set the transport USS George F. Elliott ablaze. She sank 2 days later and inflicted heavy damage upon the destroyer USS Jarvis. Over 2 days of air engagements, Japanese air units lost 36 aircraft, while the US lost 19, including 14 carrier-based planes due to both combat and operational accidents. Following these encounters, Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher grew increasingly concerned about the unexpectedly high attrition rate among his carrier fighters, the potential threat posed by renewed Japanese air attacks, and his fleet's dwindling fuel reserves. Consequently, he withdrew his carrier task force from the Solomon Islands area on the evening of 8th August. In light of the loss of carrier air cover, Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner decided to withdraw his remaining ships from Guadalcanal, even though less than half of the necessary supplies and heavy equipment for the Marines ashore had been unloaded. Turner resolved to continue offloading as much materiel as possible on Guadalcanal and Tulagi throughout the night of 8th August, before departing with his ships in the early hours of 9th of August. The Battle of Savo Island, as the Allied transports continued unloading supplies through the night of 18-9 August. 2 groups of screening cruisers and destroyers under the command of British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley were taken completely by surprise and decisively defeated by a Japanese naval force. The attacking formation, drawn from the 8th Fleet based at Rabaul and Caveying, consisted of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer commanded by Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa. In the days preceding the engagement, Mikawa's fleet had been sighted at least 5 times by Allied submarines and reconnaissance aircraft. However, a combination of misidentification of vessels, flawed intelligence interpretation, and the Allied commanders' underestimation of Japan's night fighting capabilities fostered a dangerous sense of complacency within the Allied surface fleet. The prevailing assumption among Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner and his staff was that Japanese submarine and air attacks represented the primary threat, rather than the possibility of an aggressive surface action. As a result, during the Battle of Savo Island on the night of 9th August, Mikawa's task force was able to achieve total tactical surprise. In a devastating night assault, the Japanese sank 1 Australian cruiser and 3 American cruisers, while inflicting serious damage on another US cruiser and 2 destroyers. Japanese losses were comparatively minor, with only 1 cruiser sustaining moderate damage. Despite this remarkable victory, Mikawa, unaware that Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher had already withdrawn the U.S. aircraft carriers from the area, chose to retreat immediately to Rabaul. He refrained from pressing his advantage and declined to attack the undefended Allied transports, fearing heavy losses from potential daylight air attacks once dawn broke. Deprived of carrier air cover, and facing the risk of renewed Japanese submarine and surface assaults, Rear Admiral Turner withdrew his battered naval forces from the region on the evening of 9th August. This hasty departure left the U.S. Marines on Guadalcanal under strength, as several transports had retreated before fully disembarking their troops, and without much of their essential heavy equipment and supplies. In hindsight, Mikowa's decision not to destroy the Allied transports when he had the opportunity proved to be a critical strategic mistake, allowing the Allies to maintain their precarious foothold on Guadalcanal, a position that would ultimately turn the tide of the Pacific War. The 11,000 Marines on Guadalcanal initially concentrated on forming a loose defensive perimeter centered around Lunga Point and the airfield, moving what supplies had been brought ashore within the perimeter, and completing the construction of the airfield. Over 4 days of intense effort, the supplies were moved from the landing beaches to dispersed dumps within the defensive perimeter. Work began on the airfield immediately, mainly using captured Japanese equipment. On the 12th August, the airfield was named Henderson Field after Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine aviator who was killed during the Battle of Midway. By 18th of August, the airfield was ready for operation. 55 days' worth of food had been landed from the transports, which, along with captured Japanese provisions, gave the Marines a total of 14 days' supply of food. 51 To conserve supplies, the troops were limited to 2 meals per day. Allied troops suffered from a severe strain of dysentery soon after the landings, with 1 in 5 Marines afflicted by mid-August of 53, although some of the Korean construction workers surrendered to the Marines. Most of the remaining Japanese and Korean personnel gathered just west of the Lunga perimeter on the west bank of the Matanikau River and subsisted mainly on coconuts. A Japanese naval outpost was also located at Taivu Point, about 35 kilometers 22 mi east of the Lunga perimeter. On the 8th of August, a Japanese destroyer from Rabaul delivered 113 naval reinforcement troops to the Matanikau position and 54 Goech patrol on the evening of 12th of August, a 25-man U.S. Marine patrol, led by Division D2 Lieutenant Colonel Frank Goech and primarily consisting of intelligence personnel, landed by boat west of the U.S. Marine Lunga perimeter, east of Point Cruz and west of the Japanese perimeter at Matanikau River, on a reconnaissance mission with a secondary objective of contacting a group of Japanese troops that U.S. forces believed might be willing to surrender. Soon after the patrol landed, a nearby platoon of Japanese naval troops attacked it and almost completely wiped it out. About 55 in response, on the 19th of August, Vandergrift sent 3 companies of the U.S. 5th Marine Regiment to attack the Japanese troop concentration west of the Matanikau. 1 company attacked across the sandbar at the mouth of the Matanikau River, while another crossed the river 1,000 meters Foss 100e inland and attacked the Japanese forces located in Matanikau village. The 3rd landed by boat further west and attacked Kokumbuna village. After briefly occupying the 2 villages, the 3 Marine companies returned to the Lunga perimeter, having killed about 65 Japanese soldiers while losing 4 Marines. This action, sometimes referred to as the First Battle of the Matanikau, was the first of several major actions around the Matanikau River during the campaign. 56 on the 20 August, the escort carrier USS Long Island delivered a squadron of 19 Grumman F-4F Wildcats and a squadron of 12 Douglas SBD Dauntlesses to Henderson Field. The airfield's rudimentary nature meant that carrier aircraft, designed for rough landings on flight decks at sea, were more suited for use on Henderson Field than ground-based planes. The aircraft based at Henderson became known as the Cactus Air Force, after the Allied code name for Guadalcanal, Cactus. The Marine fighters went into action the next day, which also saw the first of what would become almost daily Japanese bomber air raids on the airfield. On the 22nd of August, 5 U.S. Army Bell P-400 Airacobras and their pilots arrived at Henderson Field and 57. In reaction to the Allied landings, the Imperial Japanese General Headquarters entrusted the mission of retaking Guadalcanal to the Imperial Japanese Army's IJ 17th Army, a corps-level command based at Rabaul under Lieutenant General Harukichi Haikutake. This force was to operate in coordination with the Imperial Japanese Navy, including the combined fleet commanded by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, whose headquarters were located at Truk. At the time, however, the 17th Army was deeply engaged in the New Guinea campaign and had only limited units to deploy for the Guadalcanal operation. Among these were the 35th Infantry Brigade, led by Major General Kyoto Kawaguchi and stationed at Palau, the 4th Orbaf Infantry Regiment, commanded by Major General Yumio Nasu and based in the Philippines, and the 28th Ichiki Infantry Regiment under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, embarked on transport vessels near Guam. These units began redeploying toward Guadalcanal via truck and Rabaul at once, with Ichiki's regiment, being the nearest, arriving in the combat zone first. A first element of Ichiki's unit, composed of approximately 917 soldiers, landed at Taivu Point east of the Lunga perimeter just after midnight on the 19th of August. From there, they undertook a 9 miles 14 km night march westward toward the marine positions. 58 in 59 on gravely underestimating the strength and preparedness of the Allied forces on Guadalcanal. Ichiki ordered a nighttime frontal assault against U.S. Marine defenses along Alligator Creek, often referred to as the Ilu River, on marine maps, on the eastern side of the Lunga perimeter during the early hours of 20th August. Jacob Vuser, a Solomon Islands coastwatcher scout, alerted the Marines just minutes before the Japanese attack commenced. The assault was repelled with devastating losses to the enemy. At daybreak, Marine forces launched a counteroffensive, destroying what remained of Ichiki's troops. Among the fallen was Colonel Ichiki himself, who reportedly committed seppuku upon realizing the scale of his defeat. 60 in total, 789 of the 917 soldiers in Ichiki's advance contingent were killed. Roughly 30 survivors joined a rear guard of about 100 men, forming a group of 128th Japanese who withdrew to Taivu Point to report the catastrophe to 17th Army headquarters and await further reinforcements and orders from Rabaul. Battle of the Eastern Solomons. As the Battle of the Tenaru came to a close, further Japanese reinforcements were already en route to Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had organized an exceptionally powerful naval expeditionary force, its objective being the destruction of any American fleet elements in the Solomon Islands, followed by the annihilation of Allied ground forces at Henderson Field. This task force departed truck on the 23rd of August, while additional IJN contingents, carrying troops, supplies, and tasked with the naval bombardment of Guadalcanal, sorted from both truck and Rabaul. 62E3 slow transport vessels had left truck on the 16th of August, carrying the remaining 400 soldiers of Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment along with 500 naval marines from the 5th Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Force. 63. Their escort consisted of 13 warships under Rear Admiral Reis Tanaka, whose plan was to land the reinforcements on the 24th of August, from 64. To protect this operation and support the larger mission to retake Henderson Field, Yamamoto ordered Vice Admiral Che Echi Nagumo to sortie with a carrier task force from Truk on the 20th of August, bound for the Southern Solomons. Nagumo's fleet, comprising 3 carriers and 30 escorting warships, was to lure American aircraft into battle by sending the light carrier Raiji ahead as bait, allowing the 2 fleet carriers to strike the U.S. force once it was exposed. 62E. Meanwhile, a U.S. carrier task force under Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher moved toward Guadalcanal to counter the impending Japanese assault. 66E. On 24th August, both sides located one another and launched reciprocal carrier air strikes. The Japanese deployed the fleet carriers Shikoku and Zukoku, along with the light carrier Raiji, fielding 177 carrier-based aircraft. The Americans opposed them with the carriers Saratoga and Enterprise operating 176 aircraft. The Raiji, offered up as bait, was struck by several 1,000-pound 450 cal bombs and a torpedo, forcing her crew to abandon ship before she sank that night. 62E. While the 2 Japanese fleet carriers escaped direct attack, their aircraft managed to severely damage the Enterprise, wrecking her flight deck. Both navies withdrew from the area thereafter. Japan lost the Raiji, dozens of carrier aircraft, and most of their aircrews, while the US lost 25 planes and sustained heavy damage to the Enterprise, which required 2 months of repairs in Hawaii. 67. Unable to land on the crippled carrier, many of her surviving aircraft diverted to Henderson Field, strengthening the embattled Cactus Air Force. Simultaneously, on the 25th of August, Tanaka's convoy, led by the light cruiser Jints, was attacked near Taivu Point by aircraft from Henderson Field. The 62E. The assault sank 1 transport and inflicted severe damage across the fleet, forcing Tanaka to divert to the Shortland Islands to transfer surviving troops to destroyers for later delivery to Guadalcanal. And 68E. The Japanese transport losses included 1 sunk vessel and the destroyer Matsuki, which was damaged beyond repair and scuttled. Several other warships, including Tanaka's flagship Jints, sustained heavy damage. Tanaka consequently postponed the reinforcement mission to 28 August, intending to conduct the supply run by destroyer under cover of darkness. During this period, Japanese air raids on Guadalcanal continued almost daily. On the 25th August, the U.S. carrier Wasp, having just refueled, took up position east of Guadalcanal in anticipation of Japanese movements that never materialized. Leaving the ship idle, 62E, the Americans emerged with a modest tactical victory, having destroyed the Raiji and 75 Japanese aircraft at the cost of 25 of their own. Tanaka's forced withdrawal granted the Allied forces on Guadalcanal valuable breathing room. Although Enterprise was temporarily out of action, her absence was offset by the timely arrival of the carrier Hornet, and her displaced aircraft significantly reinforced the Allied air wing at Henderson Field. In contrast, Japanese pilots operating from Rabaul were forced to endure exhausting day-long round-trip missions to strike the island. These logistical disadvantages made daylight supply runs to Guadalcanal impossible, forcing Japan to rely exclusively on nighttime operations. Having once enjoyed dominance of the surrounding seas, the Japanese now faced the harsh reality that they could not operate safely in the Solomons by day unless Henderson Field was neutralized. 6-2 Transport Division 12. From early August through late September, the U.S. Navy largely avoided the waters surrounding Tulagi and Guadalcanal, following orders not to resupply the Marines or escort slow transports, fearing a repeat of the catastrophic Battle of Savo Island on the 9th of August, in which Allied surface vessels suffered heavy losses. During this time, the 6 high-speed transports of Transport Division 12's Transdiv 12, converted from aging World War I-era Wickes-class destroyers, were the most heavily armed U.S. surface ships operating in Iron Bottom Sound. Their torpedo mounts had been refitted to carry landing craft, allowing them to transport more than 100 additional Marines rapidly. These ships had carried the first Marines to Tulagi and Guadalcanal, conducted special operations with Marine raiders, engaged in anti-submarine warfare, and provided covering fire for Marine units onshore. They also delivered vital supplies used in the construction and maintenance of Henderson Field and its aircraft. On 1970 on the 30 August, AAPD-2 was struck by Japanese high-altitude bombers and sank with the loss of 51 crewmen. On 45 September, the USS Little APD-4 and USS Gregory APD-3 completed the landing of Marine raiders on Guadalcanal and began anti-submarine patrols, as enemy submarines had been surfacing nightly to shell Marine positions. Unaware that U.S. surface ships were present, 3 Japanese destroyers approached to bombard Henderson Field. Misidentification during the night led both U.S. vessels and a patrol aircraft to mistake the destroyers for a submarine. When the aircraft dropped illumination flarers, it inadvertently exposed Little and Gregory to enemy fire. The Japanese destroyers immediately opened fire, sinking both American ships. 5 men from Little and 24 from Gregory, including the commanding officers of both vessels and the commander of Transport Division 12, were killed in action. Air battles over Henderson Field and strengthening of the Lunga defenses throughout August 1942. Small numbers of American aircraft and aircrews continued to arrive at Guadalcanal, gradually reinforcing the Allied presence. By the end of August, a total of 64 aircraft of various types were stationed at Henderson Field. On 7-5 on the 3rd of September, Brigadier General Roy Geiger, commander of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, arrived with his staff and assumed overall command of all air operations from the field. Bot 70-60 air combat between Allied aircraft based at Henderson and Japanese bombers and fighters from Rabaul took place almost daily. Between 26 August and 5 September, the US lost approximately 15 aircraft, while the Japanese lost around 19. Over half of the downed American aircrews were rescued, whereas most of their Japanese counterparts were not. The grueling 8-hour round-trip flight from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, a distance of about 120 miles as 800 kilometers, severely hampered Japanese attempts to gain air superiority over Henderson Field. Throughout the campaign, Rabaul-based Japanese pilots had to fly nearly 600 miles before engaging Allied aircraft already operating in the immediate vicinity of Henderson Field. Furthermore, the Imperial Japanese Navy did not systematically rotate its veteran aviators out of frontline service, which gradually exhausted its skilled personnel and diminished the overall effectiveness of Japanese air power in the region. Strategically, the cumulative attrition of veteran pilots led to a marked decline in the quality of Japanese aviation in the Solomons, as battle-hardened crews were steadily replaced by inexperienced airmen with minimal combat training. Meanwhile, Australian coast watchers stationed on Bougainville and New Georgia frequently provided timely warnings of incoming Japanese air raids, giving Allied defenders at Guadalcanal enough notice to launch fighters and position them for interception. As a result, Japanese air units increasingly found themselves engaged in a war of attrition over Guadalcanal, one that they were slowly but steadily losing. 77 in 7A during the same period, Major General Alexander A. Vandergrift continued directing the expansion and reinforcement of the Lunga perimeter defences. Between 20 August and 3 September, he redeployed 3 Marine battalions, including the 1st Raider Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Edson's Raiders, and the 1st Parachute Battalion, from Tulagi and Gavutu to Guadalcanal. This redeployment added approximately 500 troops to Vandergrift's original 11,000-man force defending Henderson Field, but 79 the 1st Parachute Battalion, which had sustained heavy casualties during the Battle of Tulagi and Gavutu, Tanambogo earlier in August, was placed under Edson's command. And another redeployed unit, the 1st Battalion 5th Marine Regiment, was landed by boat west of the Matanikau River near Kokumbuna village on the 27th of August, with orders to attack Japanese forces in the area, similar to the earlier Matanikau engagement of 19th August. The Marines faced difficult terrain, oppressive heat, and strong Japanese defensive positions. By the next morning, however, the Japanese defenders had withdrawn under cover of darkness, and the Marines re-embarked by boat to return to the Lunga perimeter. Higher 81. These actions resulted in 25 Japanese and 3 Marine fatalities. Several small Allied naval convoys arrived at Guadalcanal on 23 and 29 August, and again on the 1 and 8 September, delivering additional food, ammunition, aviation fuel, aircraft technicians, and other vital supplies to the Marines stationed at Lunga Point. The 1 September convoy also brought 3 92 Seabees whose mission was to maintain and improve Henderson Field, and 83 additionally on the 3 September. Marine Aircraft Group 25 began airlifting high-priority cargo, including personnel, aviation gasoline, munitions, and essential supplies, directly to Henderson Field. By 23 August, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade arrived at Truk, where it was loaded onto slow transport vessels for the final leg of the journey to Guadalcanal. However, the severe damage inflicted on Rear Admiral Tanaka's convoy during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons forced the Japanese to reconsider using such slow transports for troop deliveries. Consequently, the ships carrying Kawaguchi's soldiers were rerouted to Rabaul. From there, Japanese planners decided to transport the brigade to Guadalcanal by means of fast destroyers operating at night, staging through the Japanese naval base in the Shortland Islands. These destroyers were typically able to complete round trips down the slot, New Georgia Sound to Guadalcanal and back within a single night throughout the campaign, thus minimizing their exposure to daytime Allied air attacks. These nocturnal reinforcement missions became known to the Allies as the Tokyo Express, while the Japanese themselves referred to them as rat transportation. 85. Although this method allowed the transport of troops, it severely restricted the delivery of heavy equipment, such as artillery vehicles and ammunition, as well as adequate food and supplies. Moreover, the operation consumed destroyers that the Imperial Japanese Navy (RJN) urgently required for escort duties elsewhere across the Pacific. The complex and fragmented command structure of the Japanese Navy in the region further aggravated logistical difficulties. Admiral Tanaka frequently received conflicting orders from Combined Fleet Headquarters and 2 competing subordinate commands at Rabaul, the 11th Air Fleet and the 8th Fleet. By 33. Nevertheless, Tanaka's relentless destroyer operations gradually strengthened the forces available to Kawaguchi on the island. Due to both inability and caution, Allied naval commanders seldom contested Japanese movements at night, allowing the Japanese to maintain control of the seas surrounding the Solomon Islands after sunset. Conversely, the steadily expanding Allied air power at Henderson Field, further reinforced on 11-12 September by 24 F-4F Wildcats made homeless after the torpedoing of the IJN submarine I-26, ensured that any Japanese vessel within 200 miles, 320 km of Guadalcanal during daylight hours was in extreme peril from air attack. This tactical balance, Japanese naval dominance by night and Allied air superiority by day, remained the defining feature of the campaign for the next several months. 86 between 29th of August and 4 September. Japanese light cruisers, destroyers, and patrol boats successfully landed nearly 5,000 troops at Taivu Point, including the majority of the 35th Infantry Brigade, much of the Oba 4th Regiment, and the remaining elements of Ichiki's regiment. General Kawaguchi, who came ashore at Taivu Point on the 31st of August, assumed overall command of all Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. 87 In addition, a barge convoy transported another 1,000 men of Kawaguchi's brigade under Colonel Kinosuke to Kamimbo, west of the Lunga perimeter. Battle of Edson's Ridge. Main article. Battle of Edson's Ridge. On and 7th of September, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi issued his formal attack plan to rout and annihilate the enemy in the vicinity of the Guadalcanal Island airfield. His strategy called for all forces under his command, divided into 3 detachments, to advance inland toward the Lunga perimeter, culminating in a coordinated surprise night assault. Colonel Akinosuke Oka's detachment would attack from the west, while Ichiki's second echelon, now reorganized and renamed the Kuma Battalion, would strike from the east. The main offensive would be carried out from the dense jungle south of the Lunga perimeter by Kawaguchi's central force, consisting of 3,000 soldiers organized into 3 battalions. 89 By 7th of September, the majority of Kawaguchi's troops had departed Taivu Point, advancing along the coastal route toward Lunga Point. Only about 250 Japanese soldiers were left behind to guard the brigade's supply base at Taivu. 90 Meanwhile, native scouts operating under the direction of Martin Clemens, a Coast Watcher officer in the British Solomon Islands Protectorate Defence Force, and the British District Officer for Guadalcanal, reported the presence of Japanese forces near Taivu, close to the village of Tasimboko. Acting on this intelligence, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Edson formulated a plan to raid the Japanese encampment at Taivu Naiwan on an 8th of September. After being landed near Taivu by boat, Edson's raiders attacked and captured Tasimboko, forcing the Japanese defenders to retreat into the jungle. 92 Within the village, the Marines discovered Kawaguchi's primary supply depot, containing large stores of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and a high-powered shortwave radio. After destroying nearly everything in the area, aside from a selection of documents and equipment taken back for analysis, the Marines withdrew safely to the Lunga perimeter. Intelligence derived from the seized materials revealed that at least 3,000 Japanese troops were already present on the island and preparing for a major assault on Henderson Field in the immediate future. 93. Correctly interpreting this intelligence, Edson, in collaboration with Colonel Gerald C. Thomas, General Vandergrift's operations officer, concluded that the main Japanese attack would likely fall on Lunga Ridge, a narrow, grassy 1,000-yard long 900-meave coral ridge running parallel to the Lunga River, just south of Henderson Field. The ridge provided a natural approach route to the airfield, offered commanding views of the surrounding terrain, and was, at that time, only lightly defended. On 11 September, Edson's battalion of 840 Marines occupied and fortified positions along and around the ridge, preparing for the anticipated assault. Battle of Edson's Ridge, the Japanese assault, on the night of 12 September. Kawaguchi's 1st Battalion launched an assault on the Marine raiders positioned between the Lunga River and the ridge, forcing one Marine company to withdraw to the ridge before the Japanese halted their offensive for the night. The following evening, Kawaguchi, commanding 3,000 troops supported by light artillery, confronted Edson's 840 Marines entrenched along the ridge. The Japanese began their coordinated attack shortly after nightfall, with the 1st Battalion striking Edson's right flank, just west of the ridge. After briefly penetrating the Marine lines, the assault was contained and repelled by American units defending the northern sector of the ridge. A 9th simultaneously, 2 companies from Kawaguchi's 2nd Battalion advanced up the southern slope of the ridge, driving Edson's men back to Hill 123, located in the ridge's central section. Throughout the night, the Marines at this position, supported by a battery of howitzers brought forward from Lunga Point, repelled successive Japanese frontal attacks, many of which escalated into brutal hand-to-hand combat. The unrelenting weight of these assaults gradually pressed the Marines back to within a quarter-mile of Henderson Field. At the height of the battle's ferocity, small Japanese detachments managed to break through Edson's defensive line, with several reaching the outskirts of the airfield itself. Some Japanese soldiers were killed as they attempted to destroy parked aircraft, and General Vandegrift's command post came under direct attack at dawn, where infiltrators were eliminated within sight of the General Dofurthinhi. By this stage, Kawaguchi's forces were exhausted, and the main Japanese offensive against Edson's Ridge positions collapsed. The supporting attacks launched by the Kuma Battalion and Oka's detachment at other points along the Lunga perimeter were likewise repelled. On the 14th of September, Kawaguchi led the remnants of his shattered brigade on a 5-day retreat westward toward the Matanako Valley to regroup with Oka's forces, to 96 V in total. Japanese casualties numbered about 850 killed, while the Marines suffered 104 deaths. On the 15th September at Rabaul, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake received news of Kawaguchi's defeat and immediately relayed the information to the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. During an emergency conference, senior Japanese Army and Navy staff officers acknowledged that Guadalcanal might develop into the decisive battle of the war. The consequences of the defeat began to exert a profound strategic impact on Japanese operations throughout the Pacific. Hyakutake realized that he could not adequately reinforce Guadalcanal while simultaneously sustaining the ongoing Japanese offensive along the Kokoda Track in New Guinea. With approval from General Headquarters, Hyakutake ordered his New Guinea forces, then within 30 miles 50 km of Port Moresby, to withdraw until the Guadalcanal matter could be resolved. He then began preparations to dispatch additional troops to the island for another major attempt to recapture Henderson Field. Consolidation of the Lunga defences as the Japanese regrouped west of the Matanako River. U.S. forces concentrated on reinforcing and strengthening their Lunga defensive perimeter. On the 14th of September, Major General Alexander Vandegrift redeployed the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marine Regiment from Tulagi to Guadalcanal. 4 days later, on the 18th of September, an Allied convoy arrived with 457 men of the 3rd Provisional Marine Brigade, including the 7th Marine Regiment, an artillery battalion from the 11th Marines, and various support units, along with 137 vehicles, tents, aviation fuel, ammunition, rations, and engineering supplies. These critical reinforcements enabled Vandegrift, beginning on the 19th of September, to form a continuous and fortified line around the Lunga perimeter. While covering this convoy, the aircraft carrier USS Wasp was scuttled after being struck by torpedoes from Japanese submarine I-19, southeast of Guadalcanal at 99. This loss severely reduced Allied naval air strength, leaving only the USS Hornet operational in the South Pacific. 100T Vandegrift also reorganized his senior leadership, removing several officers who failed to meet expectations and promoting proven junior officers to command positions. Among these was Colonel Merritt A. Edson, newly appointed commander of the 5th Marine Regiment. Willow Run renewed air operations. A temporary lull in the air war followed, as poor weather prevented any Japanese air raids between 14 and 27 September. Both sides used this respite to rebuild their air units. The Japanese reinforced Rabaul with 85 new aircraft, while the US delivered 23 additional planes to Henderson Field. By 20 September, the Japanese possessed 117 aircraft at Rabaul, while the Allies fielded 71 at Henderson Field, and hostilities resumed on the 27th of September with a Japanese air raid contested by US Navy and Marine fighters based on Guadalcanal. 103 Japanese reinforcements and strategy. Meanwhile, the Japanese began organizing their next bid to recapture Henderson Field. The 3rd Battalion, 4th Orba Infantry Regiment had landed at Kamimbo Bay on 11th of September, too late to aid Kawaguchi's attack, but soon joined Oka's forces near the Matanako. Repeated Tokyo Express runs on the 14, 20, 21, and 24th of September delivered rations, ammunition, and 280 additional men from the 1st Battalion, Oba Regiment. At the same time, the 2nd and 38th Infantry Divisions were redeployed from the Dutch East Indies to Rabaul, beginning 13th of September, with plans to send 17,500 troops to Guadalcanal for a major offensive by late October. 104 actions along the Matanako. Main article: Actions along the Matanako. Knowing that Kawaguchi's forces had withdrawn west of the Matanako River, and that scattered Japanese units still lingered between the river and the Lunga defences, Vandegrift ordered a series of small unit operations to eliminate stragglers and keep the enemy disorganized. From 23 to 27 September, elements of 3 Marine battalions attacked Japanese forces west of the Matanako, but were repelled by troops under Colonel Akinosuke Oka's command. During the battle, 3 Marine companies were surrounded near Point Cruz, suffering heavy casualties before being rescued by the destroyer USS Monson and Coast Guard landing craft. One of these craft was piloted by Douglas Munro, who was killed in action while shielding the evacuation and became the only Coast Guardsman awarded the Medal of Honor, 106 feet between 6 and 9 October. A stronger Marine force crossed the Matanico, attacking newly arrived troops of the 2nd Infantry Division under Generals Masao Maruyama and Yumio Nasu, inflicting severe losses on the 4th Infantry Regiment. This success forced the Japanese to retreat east of the river, disrupting their preparations for the planned October offensive, 127 from 9 to 11 October. The 1st Battalion, Sukan Marines, raided 2 small outposts about 30 miles east of Lunga at Gurabusu and Koilochumaria near Orla Bay, killing 35 Japanese at a cost of 17 Marines and 3 Navy personnel. 108 Battle of Cape Esperance. Main article. Battle of Cape Esperance. Through late September and early October, Tokyo Express missions continued ferrying troops from the 2nd Division to Guadalcanal. The Japanese Navy pledged to support the coming offensive by delivering supplies, intensifying air raids on Henderson Field, and conducting naval bombardments on Ohan 9A. Convinced the Marines required reinforcement, Lieutenant General Millard F. Harmon, commander of U.S. Army forces in the South Pacific, persuaded Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley to send reinforcements. On 8 October, 2 137 men of the 164th Infantry Regiment's American Division embarked from New Caledonia bound for Guadalcanal, with arrival scheduled for 13 October. To safeguard their convoy, Task Force 64, under Rear Admiral Norman Scott, consisting of 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers, was ordered to intercept any Japanese naval threat. On 100, the Japanese 8th Fleet, under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, planned a major express run for 11 October. 2 seaplane tenders and 6 destroyers were assigned to land 728 soldiers with artillery and ammunition, while a separate force, 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers under Rear Admiral Aritomo Gott, was tasked with bombarding Henderson Field to destroy the Cactus Air Force, KAF, by 100. Expecting no opposition, Gott's ships advanced unaware of Scott's force, which detected them by radar near Savo Island just before midnight. Scott's task force crossed the T of the Japanese formation, opening fire and sinking a cruiser and a destroyer, severely damaging another cruiser and mortally wounding Gott. 1 U.S. destroyer was sunk, and another destroyer and cruiser were heavily damaged. The Japanese bombardment mission was abandoned as the surviving ships retreated. Unbeknownst to Scott, the Japanese transport convoy completed unloading and withdrew undetected. Hawanhui on the 12th October. 4 Japanese destroyers from the supply group turned back to assist the damaged vessels, but were attacked by CF aircraft. 2 were sunk. Meanwhile, the U.S. convoy bearing the 164th Infantry reached Guadalcanal on the 13th October, successfully unloading troops and supplies. The 100th, the bombardment of Henderson Field. Main article. Battle for Henderson Field. Despite their naval setback, the Japanese continued preparing for their October offensive. On the 13th of October, a convoy of 6 cargo ships escorted by 8 destroyers sailed from the Shortland Islands carrying 500 troops, including elements of the 16th and 230th Infantry Regiments, Naval Marines, artillery, and tanks to 1 Nilfi. To shield this convoy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto dispatched the 3rd Battleship Division, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, to bombard Henderson Field. At 01:33 on the 14th of October, battleships Kong and Haruna, escorted by a light cruiser and 9 destroyers, opened fire from 16,000 meters or 17,500 yards. Over the next 83 minutes, they fired 9 73 40-inch shells, devastating the Lunga perimeter, destroying 48 of 90 air, and burning nearly all aviation fuel. 41 men, including 6 F pilots, were killed. By dawn, only a dozen planes remained operational. Troops later referred to this event as the night. For under 50 feet. Despite the destruction, Henderson's personnel repaired 1 runway within hours. Reinforcements, 17 SPD Dauntlesses and 20 FOF Wildcats, were flown in from Espiritu Santo, while transport aircraft ferried fuel to the island. On the 14th October, the CAF twice attacked the Japanese convoy but failed to score hits. 106 CF. The convoy reached Tassafaronga Point at midnight on the 14th of October and began unloading. The next day, CF aircraft bombed the ships, destroying 3 cargo vessels, while the remaining ships departed that night after unloading all troops and 2/3 of their cargo. Japanese heavy cruisers bombarded Henderson again on the nights of 14 and 15th of October, inflicting minor additional damage. 117 Battle for Henderson Field. Between 1 and 17th of October, the Japanese delivered 15,000 troops, giving Hyakutake about 20,000 men for his impending offensive. The loss of terrain east of the Matanako convinced the Japanese that a coastal assault would be untenable. Hyakutake therefore ordered Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama's 2nd Division, reinforced by the 38th Division, to advance through the jungle and attack from the south of Henderson Field, near the Lunga River, with 7,000 troops in 3 regiments. 100 date was first set for 20 October, later delayed to 23 October. To divert American attention, Major General Tadashi Sumiyoshi's artillery and 5 infantry battalions, the 900 men, were to attack from the west. Japanese intelligence estimated 10,000 U.S. troops on Guadalcanal, though the true number exceeded 23. Zalosenpoin Despite numerical superiority, American commanders remained cautious, preparing for the possibility of being overrun and instructing units to fight as guerrillas if necessary. The 1st Marine Division's intelligence staff began destroying classified material, and in Washington, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox declined to guarantee that Guadalcanal could be held. October. A company of Japanese engineers began constructing a trail, later known as the Maruyama Road, stretching from the Mataniko area toward the southern portion of the American Lunga perimeter. This 15-mile, 24-km route traversed some of the harshest terrain on Guadalcanal, cutting through numerous rivers, muddy ravines, steep ridges, and thick jungle growth. Between 16 and 18 October, the Japanese 2nd Division commenced its arduous advance along the Maruyama Road. By 23 October, Maruyama's troops were still struggling through the dense wilderness to reach the American defenses. That evening, after learning that his divisions had not yet arrived at their assigned attack positions, Hyakutake delayed the assault until 1900 on the 24th October. Unaware of the Japanese approach, American forces remained on alert but uninformed of the danger closing in upon them. Meanwhile, Major General Sumiyoshi was notified by Hyakutake's staff of the postponed offensive, but was unable to communicate the change to his forward troops. Consequently, at dusk on 23 October, 2 battalions of the 4th Infantry Regiment and 9 tanks from the 1st Independent Tank Company launched premature attacks on U.S. Marine positions at the mouth of the Matanako River. Heavy American artillery, cannon, and small arms fire shattered the assault, annihilating all 9 tanks and inflicting severe casualties on the Japanese while sustaining only light Marine losses. Late on the 24th October, Maruyama's exhausted troops finally reached the Lunga perimeter. Over the following 2 nights, they mounted a series of fierce frontal assaults against positions defended by the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, led by Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, and the U.S. Army's 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hall, armed with rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery, including direct canister fire from 37 Maus anti-tank guns. The Americans inflicted catastrophic losses on the attackers. A handful of Japanese units broke through the defensive lines, but were hunted down and eliminated over the next several days. More than 500 of Maruyama's men were killed in the engagements, while American forces suffered roughly 60 dead. During the same period, aircraft from Henderson Field repelled Japanese air and naval attacks, destroying 14 enemy planes and sinking the light cruiser Yura. Further Japanese attempts near the Mataniko on the 26th of October were also repulsed with devastating losses. By 08 Hosa that morning, Hyakutake called off all remaining assaults and ordered a full withdrawal. Roughly half of Maruyama's survivors retreated toward the upper Matanako Valley, while the 230th Infantry Regiment, under Colonel Toshinari Shiji, was directed to move east toward Coley Point. Leading elements of the 2nd Division reached the 17th Army headquarters at Kokumbona, west of the Matanako, on 4th November. That same day, Shiji's troops reached Coley Point and encamped there. Ravaged by combat casualties, starvation, and disease, the 2nd Division could no longer undertake offensive operations and was relegated to defensive roles along the coast for the remainder of the campaign. In total, the Japanese suffered between 200 and 3,000 fatalities in these actions, compared with approximately 80 American dead. Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, as Hyakutake's forces pressed their assault on the Lunga perimeter. A massive Japanese naval contingent, comprising 2 fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, 2 light carriers, 4 battleships, and numerous support vessels, moved into position near the southern Solomon Islands. Commanded by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, this fleet represented the largest assembly of Japanese naval power since the Battle of Midway. Yamamoto's objective was to lure the principal Allied carrier forces, particularly the American task groups, into a decisive engagement while the Army attacked Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Allied naval forces in the region, now under the command of Admiral William Halsey Jr., also prepared for confrontation. On 18 October, Admiral Chester Nimitz had replaced the pessimistic and fatigued Admiral Gormley with Halsey, judging him better suited to the aggressive leadership required in the South Pacific. Faulty reports from Hyakutake suggesting that Japanese ground troops had captured Henderson Field on the night of 25 October prompted Yamamoto to order his fleet southward to engage the Americans. On the morning of 26 October, the opposing carrier groups clashed in what became known as the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the last major carrier duel of the Pacific War until the Battle of the Philippine Sea nearly 2 years later. After fierce exchanges of air strikes, the Allied surface forces were forced to withdraw, losing one carrier Hornet and sustaining heavy damage to another Enterprise. Despite these setbacks, Japanese carrier aviation suffered crippling losses. Nearly 150 experienced pilots were killed or lost at sea. Although Japan claimed a tactical victory based on ship losses, the attrition of its irreplaceable aircrews handed the Allies a long-term strategic advantage. Japanese carriers would never again play a decisive role in the Guadalcanal campaign. November land operations. To capitalize on their victory in the battle for Henderson Field, General Vandegrift ordered a westward offensive beyond the Matanico. 6 Marine battalions, later reinforced by an Army battalion, advanced under the command of Colonel Merritt Edson toward Cocombona, headquarters of the Japanese 17th Army, west of Point Cruz. Defending the area were remnants of the 4th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Nomasu Nakaguma, whose forces were depleted by previous battles, disease and starvation. The American attack began on the 1st of November and annihilated the Japanese defenders of Point Cruz by 3rd November, including reinforcing elements sent to bolster Nakaguma's shattered regiment. The Marines appeared poised to capture Cocombona when new intelligence revealed Japanese activity near Coley Point, east of the Lunga perimeter. To counter this emerging threat, Vandegrift temporarily halted the western advance on 4th of November. The operation had cost the Americans 71 dead, while the Japanese suffered roughly 400 fatalities. At dawn on the 3rd of November, 5 Japanese destroyers landed 300 soldiers to reinforce Shiji's exhausted forces near Coley Point. Learning of the landing, Vandegrift dispatched a Marine battalion under Major Herman H. Hannikin to intercept them. The Japanese quickly counterattacked, forcing Hannikin's men back toward the Lunga defenses. In response, Vandegrift deployed Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller's battalion, 2 battalions of the 164th Infantry Regiment, and Hannikin's survivors to mount a coordinated offensive against the Japanese positions. Meanwhile, Shiji's contingent was consolidating near Coley Point. Beginning on 8th of November, American forces attempted to encircle his troops at Gavaga Creek. However, Hyakutake ordered Shiji to break out and rejoin the Japanese lines at Cocombona. Exploiting a gap through a swampy creek on the southern flank of the American lines, Shiji and 2,000–3,000 of his men escaped into the jungle between 9 and 11 November. On the 12th of November, American forces eliminated the remaining Japanese holdouts, counting 454–75 enemy bodies and seizing most of their heavy weapons and supplies. U.S. losses totaled 40 dead and 120 wounded. At the same time, 2 companies of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson landed at Orla Bay, 40 miles, 64 km east of Lunga Point, on 4th of November. Their mission was to secure an airfield construction site for 500 CBs, assisted by elements of the Army's 147th Infantry Regiment. However, the project was abandoned by late November when the terrain proved unsuitable for air operations. On the 5th of November, Vandegrift ordered Carlson's raiders to advance overland from Orla to locate and destroy remnants of Shiu's retreating forces. Joined by additional companies a few days later, Carlson's men embarked on a grueling 29-day jungle patrol back to the Lunga perimeter. Engaging in several skirmishes along the route, they killed nearly 500 Japanese soldiers while losing 16 of their own. Disease and starvation decimated Shiji's troops during their retreat. By mid-November, only about 300 men remained with him. When he finally reached Japanese lines west of the Matanico, merely 700–800 soldiers were left alive. These survivors later joined other units defending the Mount Austin and Upper Matanikau regions. Tokyo Express destroyer runs on 5/7 and 9th of November delivered reinforcements from the 38th Infantry Division, including most of the 228th Regiment. These fresh troops stabilized Japanese positions near Point Cruz and the Matanikau, successfully resisting further American assaults on 10 and 18 November. Both sides then settled into a tense standoff along a defensive line west of Point Cruz that lasted 6 weeks. Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Following their defeat at Henderson Field, the Japanese army planned a renewed attempt to recapture the airfield in November 1942, requiring additional reinforcements. Admiral Yamamoto assembled a convoy of 11 large transports to carry 7th Alausan troops of the 38th Division along with their equipment, ammunition and food from Rabaul to Guadalcanal. To safeguard this convoy, he assigned 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, equipped with special fragmentation shells to bombard Henderson Field on the night of 12-13 November. Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe commanded the warship escort from aboard Hiei. By early November, Allied intelligence intercepted indications of the renewed Japanese offensive. In response, on 11 November, Rear Admiral Richmond Turner's Task Force 67 delivered reinforcements and supplies to Guadalcanal, including marine replacements, 2 army battalions, food, and ammunition. The transports were shielded by 2 task groups under Rear Admirals Daniel J. Callaghan and Norman Scott, supported by aircraft from Henderson Field. Although attacked repeatedly by Japanese bombers on 11-12 November, most Allied ships completed unloading with minimal damage. Reconnaissance soon detected Abe's approaching bombardment group, and Turner ordered Callaghan to intercept. Around 01:30 on the 13th of November, the 2 forces clashed in near total darkness between Savo Island and Guadalcanal. In a chaotic close-range melee, Japanese gunfire sank or crippled nearly all of Callaghan's cruisers and destroyers. Both Callaghan and Scott were killed in action. Although the Americans suffered heavily, Abe's forces also sustained serious damage. 2 destroyers were lost, Hiei was crippled, and another destroyer badly hit. Despite the tactical victory, Abe withdrew without bombarding Henderson Field, and Hiei sank later that day following repeated air attacks from Henderson and the carrier Enterprise. Yamamoto, furious at the failure to neutralize the airfield, ordered Nobutake Kon to assemble another bombardment group to attack on the 15th of November. Meanwhile, on the 14th of November, a cruiser-destroyer force under Admiral Gunichi Mikowa shelled Henderson Field, but caused limited damage. Believing the airfield destroyed, Tanaka's transport convoy began its rundown, the slot, toward Guadalcanal. Throughout 14th of November, aircraft from Henderson and Enterprise relentlessly struck the Japanese, sinking 1 heavy cruiser and 7 transports. Though many troops were rescued by destroyers and returned to the Shortlands, the remaining 4 transports pressed on toward Guadalcanal under Konda's covering force. Halsey, short on operational warships, dispatched the battleships Washington and South Dakota with 4 destroyers under Admiral Willis Lee to intercept Kond. Near midnight on the 14th of November, Lee's force engaged the Japanese near Savo Island. In the ensuing battle, 3 U.S. destroyers were sunk, South Dakota was damaged, but Washington managed to approach undetected and devastate Kirishima with accurate gunfire, forcing Konda to retreat without bombarding Henderson Field. Kirishima sank soon afterward. As Konda withdrew, the remaining 4 Japanese transports ran aground at Tassaronga Point at 04:500 on the 15th November. By sunrise, U.S. aircraft and artillery obliterated the stranded ships and their supplies. Only 2,000 or 3,000 troops made it ashore. Deprived of reinforcements and material, the Japanese abandoned plans for another major offensive on Guadalcanal. This decisive Allied victory marked the turning point of the campaign and effectively ended Japan's hopes of reclaiming Henderson Field. On the 26th November, Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura assumed command of the new 8th Area Army at Rabaul, which included Hyakutake's 17th Army and the 18th Army in New Guinea. Imamura initially sought to renew efforts to retake Guadalcanal, but shifted focus to New Guinea when Allied offensives at Buna threatened Rabaul directly. Battle of Tassafaronga. By late November, the Japanese faced extreme difficulty sustaining their forces on Guadalcanal. Submarine supply runs had failed, and attempts to establish barge routes through the Central Solomons were thwarted by constant Allied air attacks. On the 26th of November, Hyakutake reported a catastrophic food shortage. Front-line troops had gone 6 days without rations, and even rear units were surviving on 1/3 portions. Desperate, the Japanese resumed destroyer-based supply missions despite their limited capacity. To improve efficiency, the 8th Fleet staff devised an innovative system. Oil drums cleaned and filled with food and medical supplies, partially air-filled for buoyancy, were linked by ropes and dropped at sea near Guadalcanal. Shore parties would retrieve the ropes and haul the drums ashore. Admiral Reis Tanaka's reinforcement unit, nicknamed the Tokyo Express, was tasked with making the first major drum run to Tassafaronga on 30 November. His force included 8 destroyers, 6 of which carried 240 supply drums each. Alerted by intelligence, Admiral Halsey ordered Task Force 67, under Rear Admiral Carleton H. Wright, to intercept Tanaka. The task force comprised 4 cruisers and 4 destroyers, later joined by 2 more en route. At 22:40, Tanaka's ships arrived off Guadalcanal to unload supplies. Wright's force approached through Iron Bottom Sound and detected the enemy on radar. The destroyer commander requested permission to fire torpedoes, but Wright hesitated for 4 minutes, allowing Tanaka's fleet to maneuver away from an optimal position. The American torpedoes missed entirely. Wright's cruisers opened fire, sinking 1 guard destroyer, but the rest of Tanaka's ships responded with a devastating volley of 44 torpedoes. 4 struck their marks, sinking Northampton and heavily damaging Minneapolis, New Orleans and Pensacola. Tanaka's destroyers escaped unscathed but failed to deliver their cargo. By 7 December 1942, Japanese troops on Guadalcanal were perishing at a rate of 50 men per day from starvation, disease, and Allied attacks. Further Tokyo Express attempts on 3/7 and 11 December failed, and one of Tanaka's destroyers was sunk by an American PT boat. Recognizing the hopeless situation, Tanaka informed Admiral Mikawa that continued supply by sea was impossible and recommended evacuation. Shortly afterward, he was reassigned to an administrative position in Singapore. Japanese decision to withdraw main article Operation K. On the 12th of December, the Imperial Japanese Navy proposed the abandonment of Guadalcanal. Simultaneously, several officers within the Imperial General Headquarters, IGH Army Section, concluded that any further attempt to retake the island was impossible. A delegation headed by Colonel Joichiro Sanada, chief of the IGH Operations Section, arrived at Rabaul on 19th December to confer with General Hitoshi Imamura and his staff. Upon returning to Tokyo, Sanada submitted a formal recommendation that Guadalcanal be relinquished. On 26th December, the senior leadership of the IGH approved Sanada's proposal and directed their staffs to begin drafting plans for a full withdrawal from Guadalcanal, the establishment of a new defensive line in the central Solomon Islands, and the reallocation of strategic resources toward the campaign in New Guinea. On the 28th of December, General Hajime Sugiyama and Admiral Osamu Nagano personally informed Emperor Hirohito of the decision to withdraw. 3 days later, on the 31st of December, Hirohito gave his formal sanction. Preparations for the secret evacuation, designated Operation K, began immediately, with the withdrawal scheduled to commence in late January 1943. At this stage, Japanese strength on Guadalcanal had been reduced to fewer than 15,000 men. Battle of Mount Austin, the Galloping Horse, and the Sea Horse. Main article Battle of Mount Austin, the Galloping Horse, and the Sea Horse. By December 1942, the exhausted U.S. 1st Marine Division was withdrawn for rest and recuperation. Over the following month, command of ground operations on Guadalcanal passed to the newly formed U.S. IV Corps, comprising the 2nd Marine Division and the U.S. Army's 25th Infantry and 23rd Americal Divisions. On 9th of December, Major General Alexander M. Patch replaced Major General Alexander A. Vandergrift as overall commander of Allied forces on the island, which by January numbered slightly more than 50,000 troops. On the 18th of December, Allied forces, primarily U.S. Army units, launched an assault against Japanese positions on Mount Austin. Their advance was checked by a heavily fortified Japanese stronghold known as the Gifu, forcing the Americans to suspend operations temporarily on the 4th of January. Renewing the offensive on the 10th of January, the Allies attacked Japanese positions on Mount Austin and 2 adjacent ridges called the Sea Horse and the Galloping Horse. After fierce combat and difficult terrain fighting, all 3 objectives were secured by 23rd of January. Simultaneously, U.S. Marines advanced along the island's northern coastline, making substantial territorial gains. American casualties during these operations totaled approximately 250 killed, whereas Japanese losses exceeded 3,000, an exchange ratio of roughly 12-1 in favor of the Allies. Operation Key Evacuation. See also Battle of Rennell Island on the 14th of January. A Tokyo Express run delivered a battalion of Japanese troops to Guadalcanal to serve as a rearguard for the upcoming evacuation under Operation KE. A staff officer from Rabaul accompanied the detachment to inform Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake of the Imperial decision to withdraw. Meanwhile, Japanese warships and aircraft repositioned around Rabaul and Bougainville in preparation for the operation. Although Allied intelligence detected the increased Japanese activity, analysts misinterpreted it as preparations for a renewed offensive to retake Henderson Field and Guadalcanal. Acting on this belief, General Patch committed only a limited portion of his forces to continue a slow, methodical advance against Hyakutake's positions. On the 29th of January, Admiral William Halsey, operating under the same assumption, dispatched a resupply convoy to Guadalcanal, escorted by a cruiser task force. That evening, Japanese torpedo bombers attacked, striking the cruiser USS Chicago and inflicting heavy damage. The next day, additional Japanese aircraft returned and sank Chicago. Halsey then recalled the remaining task force and repositioned the rest of his naval assets to the Coral Sea, south of Guadalcanal, in readiness to repel what he still believed would be a major Japanese counteroffensive. During this period, Hyakutake's 17th Army withdrew steadily toward the island's western coast, while rearguard elements held off the American advance. On the night of 1 February, a flotilla of 20 destroyers from Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's 8th Fleet, under Rear Admiral Shinta Hashimoto, successfully evacuated 4 935 troops, primarily from the 38th Division, from Guadalcanal. Both sides lost a destroyer in the air and naval actions connected to the operation. Further evacuations occurred on the nights of 4 and 7th of February, when Hashimoto's destroyers extracted the remaining Japanese forces. Apart from sporadic air attacks, the Allies, still anticipating a large-scale Japanese offensive, did not interfere with the withdrawal. In total, the Japanese successfully evacuated 10,652 men from Dot. The last Japanese soldiers departed on the evening of 7th of February, exactly 6 months after the initial American landings. 2 days later, on the 9th February, General Patch confirmed that all enemy forces had withdrawn and officially declared Guadalcanal secure.